Let's start with a rather important concept. We live in an era of absolutes and absolutism. Social media, in particular the erstwhile, once upon a time, 280 characters limitation of X, formerly Twitter, which is still in effect outside the US, and the more generous Instagram limit, has effectively dumbed down the debate so that everything is a matter of an absolute. It is one thing, it is another, and what is lost is nuance. What is also lost is the fact that there are things that can't be talked about seriously or can't be explained in a small paragraph or in a soundbite. They're complex issues, and if you dumb them down to the soundbite, you don't do any favor to it. The problem is that it's not just social media, it's also politicians who try to make their comments in very short sentences, hoping to get something on the evening news or quoted somewhere on social media. And the fact is that when we're talking, what we're talking about on all levels is complicated. Let's start with the obvious. But for the past 9 months, we have been viewing the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism on college campuses, university campuses, not just in the United States, but around the world. That is not something new. The problem is that this has been around for quite a while. October 7th only served to exacerbate it and to make it that much more intense. But we've been living with anti-Israel and anti-Zionist demonstrations and manifestations for quite a while. It doesn't help if the situation gets into the demonstrators are all bad or the demonstrators have a point, because, again, there is a problem. October 7th was the mildest way of describing it. It was a pogrom. But it was a pogrom which was far more extensive than any we have seen since 1945 anywhere. That in and of itself presents a problem, because after the immediate shockwave, there was this question of whether or not to condemn Hamas. Now, let me make it very clear. As far as I'm concerned, Hamas is a genocidal organization whose covenant, whose charter wants the destruction of the state of Israel and the elimination of all Jews living there. That doesn't leave much for discussion. You don't enter into a discussion with a Nazi who is about to kill you, and you don't go into a discussion with someone from Hamas because what they want is not palatable, not acceptable in our society. That gets us to the next stage, which is, what does Israel do? It takes Israel about 2 days to get control of the situation. So now Israel decides, quite legitimately, that it wants to eliminate Hamas as an existential threat. It wants to make sure that nothing like October 7th can ever happen again. Problem is that it's been 9 months. It's been a war which, by all accounts, has taken up thousands of lives. And while a large number of Hamas combatants have been killed, the situation is not anywhere near an acceptable solution, which gets us to a problem. For a small period of time, October 7th and 8th, the world was horrified by what had happened. And then, since then, we have been subjected to the world looking at the Palestinians as the victims and Israel as the aggressor, with much of the intellectual community taking the, shall we say, the woke or the popular position of viewing Israel as the usurper, the country that took the land from the Palestinians are fighting back. Now, of course, that is not true, but why do I say it's not true, but? Because, yes, we, the Jewish people, have a right to our homeland in Israel. But at the same time, it's not the only right. Abba Eban, the longtime foreign minister of Israel, used to say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict between right and wrong. It's a conflict between two rights. And once you understand that, you get into the nuance. My grandson, who's 15 and a half, asked me about who had the right to the land. I said, okay, let's assume for the moment that we accept the biblical narrative that God told Abraham to leave wherever he was in Iraq, somewhere in Iraq, and go over and come to what is now in the land of Israel. And God gave the land to the Jewish people. Except I asked my grandson, what happened when Abraham's wife Sarah died? Abraham purchased the land that he needed for a burial site. And in fact, the locals wanted to give it to him. And he said, no, I must buy it because that's the only way I can own it. But it tells you that at that point, there were others living there. There were others living there already. And that has been the case ever since, which does not lessen the Jewish right to come back to Israel and the Zionist cause, but the idea that the local population can be ignored or is somehow less legitimate in the place than we are presents a problem. Morally, it's a problem because they've been there. Politically, it's a problem because the international community is not going to allow them to be moved out. And fortunately, other than a couple of extremist members of the government, no one has been talking seriously about that. This is why the claim that Israel has been or is committing genocide is a false one, because there is agreement by everyone, including perhaps not necessarily Mr. Netanyahu, that after this war is over, there will be somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza. And there are about 3 million Palestinians living on the West Bank. I see 4 possible solutions to the conflict. Number 1, the Hamas solution. Let's just get rid of Israel. Send the Jews back to wherever they came from or whatever. Well, that's not going to happen. Israel will not allow it to happen. The international community will not allow it to happen. Then there's the other, which is the agenda of some politicians, to move the Palestinians, move the Arabs off into Jordan, off into somewhere. Okay, that's not going to happen either. Let me ask you something. What is Israel's legitimacy? Let's go to the more recent development. November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine into 2 entities, a Jewish entity, a Jewish state, and an Arab state. That was preceded by lengthy discussion in 2 speeches. The then permanent representative of the Soviet Union at the United Nations, a man named Andrei Gromyko, who subsequently became foreign minister and then president, argued that the international community owed a debt to the survivors of the Shoah, that the international community had failed them. And he said that ideally Palestine should be a state where Jews and Arabs can live together jointly. But he said that's clearly not going to happen. The period from 1920, the entire period of the British mandate over Palestine, had demonstrated that this is not going to work. At which point there was the vote to separate the two entities. The legitimacy that Israel has from that vote is exactly the same legitimacy that the Palestinians have to say that on the land that is not Israel, they have the right to their own state. Now, yes, I know, the Arab never accepted it, the Arab went into several wars, but it still is a reality. In 1948, the Arab countries did not accept Israel. 1956, we'll put that one aside because that was a stupid. The Sinai War was a stupid war that had nothing whatsoever to do with Israel, and the Brits and the French decided to go on the Suez Canal, and Israel jumped on the bandwagon. That lasted a bit. It went back. 1967 was much more serious. Israel took the Sinai Peninsula in its entirety, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. By the way, the West Bank Israel wouldn't have gotten the West Bank if King Hussein of Jordan had agreed to stay out of the war, which is what Israel was begging him to do. You then had the Yom Kippur War, because clearly this wasn't going to be accepted. And then you had something very interesting happen. Between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, with the assistance of Jimmy Carter at Camp David, lo and behold, in exchange for peace, Israel gave back the absolute entire Sinai Peninsula, and there has been a peace, cold, warm, friendly, less friendly. Yeah, I was about to get to that. Menachem Begin begged Sadat to take Gaza. And from what I understand from someone who was there, Sadat basically laughed in his face and said, you know what, we had them for 19 years. We didn't like the experience. Okay, good luck. You take care of it. But then, and you had, between the intifadas and such, you had a non-acceptance until 1988. Now, understand that the Palestinian national movement exists. Golda Meir said there are no Palestinians. Until about 1951 or 1952, the only people who were called Palestinians were Jews. The Jerusalem Post was the Palestine Post. So the Arabs considered themselves Arabs. They didn't consider themselves Palestinians. But you know what? Circumstances change. And at a given point, people who at one point didn't have a nationalism developed a nationalism. You can like it, you can not like it, but it's there, it's a reality. The solutions are either a binational state, let everybody live together. By the way, that worked very well in Yugoslavia, it worked very well it's the only country in which you have a multinational state that hasn't degenerated into warfare is Switzerland. And that's because nobody cares. The French are doing their thing.
They want peace.
They don't have a conflict. Now, if you don't want a binational state, a two-state solution in some format, and I don't know under what matrix, when, how, but getting the Palestinians out of the Israeli body politic is critical. And you may like it, I may like it, I may not like it. The international community will not allow 5 million people to be in a permanent state of disenfranchisement. Until 1988, the Palestinian national movement, represented by the PLO, was unwilling to accept Israel. In 1988, and this is something I was actually involved in at the time, the PLO changed its position in a number of different, starting with the Arab Summit in Algiers, and then with a number of meetings in Stockholm, Geneva, and onward, whereby the PLO recognized Israel and accepted Israel's existence. For the past 15 years, the Prime Minister of Israel has refused to talk with the President of the Palestinian Authority. The problem is you've got to deal with it, and the Palestinian Authority is willing to enter into discussion. You don't trust them, I don't either. What happens then? And this is where the problem gets us to October 7th. I do not subscribe to the position, I reject the position that anything that Hamas did on October 7th was in any way defensible or legitimate. However, how did Hamas get to that position? Hamas, over the past 15 years, was given carte blanche by Netanyahu and his government to take billions of dollars in from Qatar and elsewhere that the Hamas took, did not provide for services for its people, managed to build all of the underground tunnels that we have, and created a situation which in large part was the result of Netanyahu preferring not to deal with Hamas and having to deal with the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas taking full advantage of the situation. If they hadn't gotten that kind of funding in there, they wouldn't have been in the position of starting this particular massacre.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because you're in the academic community, there has been a tracing back to post-colonial studies. This notion that, the Shoah was horrible, but it was not singularly horrible. There were all of these crimes that were affected by colonial powers on peoples of the global south, and there is this academic movement, I think maybe since the 70s, to try and equivocate and kind of erase the uniqueness of the Shoah, and that this is possibly one of the academic underpinnings, right, where you have people who, and maybe in the spirit of being fair-minded, but also being very largely guided by unconscious anti-Semitism, they want to diminish it. And there was I'd just like to speak about this generally, there was a Jewish historian who said, what people do not understand about the Shoah was that it was not just the elimination of the Jewish people, it was the elimination of Jewish culture. It was the Nazi intent to not just erase the Jewish people, but to erase any history of Jewish culture, Jewish music, Jewish literature. If they had had their way, there would be no record of the Jewish people. And that this is the kind of the peculiar or pernicious.
That's a different lecture, actually.
Okay.
That's a different lecture.
Come back next week.
I'm happy to, but
So focusing on anti-Semitism, the crowds at the universities, the crowds in the streets, are we entering into a generational situation where anti-Semitism will become embedded across all facets of American society?
I don't think so. Now, having said that, let's go step one. Yes, the entire idea that Israel is an illegitimate state is an anti-Semitic trope that is accepted by a good part of the academic community, not by all. I mean, I teach at a university where we don't have, where those views are very much in a minority, and there are a number of them around. We're sitting with Columbia, where I also teach, which is a disaster area. But that also, by the way, it's not just the issue of the Shoah. That is the idea that, for those of you who have kids in private schools, the idea that whites are the oppressors, all people of color are the oppressed, and if you happen to be Jewish, never mind the Shoah, never mind that at some point not too long ago you were in the Pale of the Settlement and not receiving particularly warm attentions from a collection of czars onwards. That's irrelevant. All of it, and that is in fact a serious problem, and it does lend to a kind of ingrained anti-Semitism. The reason I'm optimistic is I think there are enough people around to push back against it. Look, when you have a massive initiative by the President of the United States, by the administration, in order to fight anti-Semitism, and is doing it seriously, when you have the Justice Department investigating universities and holding them to account, when you have 2 days ago Facebook, now Meta, agreeing for the first time that they will bar the use of the term Zionist when it is done in a hostile fashion. They will not ban it by saying that, if you say I'm opposed to Zionism or I'm opposed to the Zionist ideology, that is okay. But if you start talking about death to Zionists or Zionists are criminals or something of that, that has now been recognized and is being removed. Some former colleagues of mine are now working on exactly the same thing with X, formerly Twitter. So the point is, I don't think we are necessarily losing the war. I think that also once the Gaza war stops being an active, hot war, there'll be a possibility of getting back. Will it be perfect? No. Your comment about Theodor Herzl, the problem is that Theodor Herzl had an idea. He had absolutely no concept of the practicalities involved, and his Zionism was a reaction to anti-Semitism as he saw it in the Dreyfus Affair, and it was a solution that he thought was going to work, but it didn't take into account some of the logistics on the ground. What Herzl would say today, he would probably be appalled, but I'm not sure that he'd recognize what is happening. But then again, Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was the ideological father of the Likud movement, also believed that Arabs living within Israel should have full rights. So,
They do. Arab Israelis do. Arab Israelis.
Yes, I know, but I didn't say this as a polemic. The point being, the question then comes, Arab Israelis have full rights. At some stage, somebody will have to decide whether the Palestinians get full rights within Israel or get full rights somewhere else. But you're not going to have people with full rights. No, look, I always thought that the biggest mistake that Yasser Arafat made at the beginning after 1967, what they should have done is say, you want the West Bank? It's yours. Gaza, take it. The Golan Heights, Jerusalem, it's all yours. Annex it, make it part of Israel. We are the first to endorse the Greater Israel movement. Only one very small condition. We get the right to vote. See you in two elections.
They would never agree to
No.
that.
I'm not being serious. I'm saying, had they done that, they would have put the Israel government into a dilemma. But it's not happening. The same Abba Eban also used to say that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So you're not dealing with a deck of cards you'd want. But if you're talking about anti-Semitism, let's understand something. I don't know how much time you want me to talk, but I'll make 2 points. One is on anti-Semitism, the second is on Zionism. And they're actually related points. Anti-Semitism is not this monolithic dislike. Unlike Islamophobia or homophobia or anti-black racism or any other form of bigotry, anti-Semitism is different. Not more serious, not more heinous, but different. Different how? All other forms of bigotry are binary in nature. They are based on somebody's religion. They are based on someone's color, or they're based on someone's ethnicity, or they're based on a conception of race. But it's binary. All of a sudden here, with anti-Semitism, there are all kinds of variations, and they don't necessarily gel. You have religious anti-Semitism, going for a couple of thousand years. Jews killed Christ, which gave us all the lovely pogroms and others over the centuries. Then you have the idea that the Jew as the other, the Jew as the non-Christian, the Jew who doesn't meld in, or the Jew as a non-Muslim, it doesn't matter.
They othered us.
The other. And the other then becomes a convenient tool for the ruling authority who makes use of the Jews. What do I say by that? What is the one distinction that Jewish boys, Jewish men have over most of the other people over several thousand years? Right, exactly.
Circumcision.
I mean, speak for yourself, but that's it. But that's illiterate. So what does that mean? That means that they are useful to do what? To collect taxes. In Christian Europe, you couldn't lend money for interest. And so you end up with Jews doing that. And guess what? The persona of Shylock in...
Merchant of Venice.
What?
Merchant of Venice.
Yes, the persona. But who does Shylock become? Bankers. I mean, a moneylender who starts expanding a little bit becomes a banker. So all of a sudden, the Jews are the capitalists. The Jews are the bankers. So you have that element thrown in. The Jews control the newspapers. Well, they didn't. But why do the Jews end up in newspapers? Because they weren't allowed in other professions, and the newspaper business was a relatively new business that was not dominated by certain elites. And so literate Jews came in. So, okay, so you now have the Jews as a capitalist. But you see, Jews also end up being part of the revolutionary. They want to do something to better the quality of life of the majority of the Jews living in places like the Pale of the Settlement, with which some people here are familiar. And so you end up with men like Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev and Radek being viewed as the Bolsheviks or the socialists. And guess what? At the same time, the Jews are the capitalists and they're the socialists. And then, just to add insult to injury, in the 19th century, you start having a bogus racial science developed, which the Nazis turned into a pseudoscience, where there is this entire panoply. And then, of course, you end up with the Zionist dimension, with Israel as the colonial exploiter. All of these meld. The reason this is important in understanding anti-Semitism is that the anti-Semitism of the football fans, soccer, but the European football fan in Croatia or in England who yell out anti-Semitic slurs is not the same as the folks in the encampment at Columbia and UCLA, is not the same as. Now, why is that important? Because in order to get rid of anti-Semitism, we have to understand what we're talking about. And we also have to understand that we cannot view all support of Palestinians as necessarily anti-Semitic. Can we agree in this room that the phrase, "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," is an anti-Semitic phrase?
Yes.
Of course.
It is something.
Okay, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I suggest to you that by changing a couple of letters, the phrase would take on a completely different meaning. From the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free. Oh, you mean Palestinians will be free in the same way that Jews will be free, that Bedouins will be free, that Druze will be free? I'm not arguing that as a new mantra for the demonstration. I'm simply saying that it depends what people are doing. If you are saying, if somebody decides to be compassionate or be horrified at the fact that Palestinian civilians are being killed or children are being killed, that's not necessarily anti-Semitic. Assume for a moment that a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia gets made, as it now exists with the Emirates, as exists with Jordan, as exists with Egypt. At a given point, attitudes change, mindset change. Somebody raised before the fact that the Civil War ended. Well, it actually didn't, because following the Civil War, there was a brief period of Reconstruction, and then you had close to 100 years of Jim Crow, segregation. Let me ask you something. Is everybody here more or less familiar with the Nuremberg laws?
Yes.
Well, there were two. I mean, actually there were three. One of them dealt with the German flag. We'll put that aside. But there were two involving Jews. One was the depriving Jews of citizenship and providing as a basis for Jews not being able to be in certain professions and various things. And the other one was the law for racial purity, which barred sexual interaction between Jews and Aryans. While Lenin and Marx and other socialist and Bolshevik and Menshevik ideologues wrote lengthy, complicated treatises and actually had an intellectual mindset. The Nazis didn't. They came into this with very little of an intellectual base for their ideology. And what they did was that they stole the Jim Crow laws, and they stole the anti-miscegenation laws that were in effect in about 25 plus states in the 1930s, and still were in effect in 13 states until 1967. The reason I'm saying this is that today, what used to be a mindset in the southern states, when I was growing up still, when I was at college, and I was in Maryland, that mindset has changed. Is it a guarantee? No. I'm not going to tell you that all of a sudden the Palestinians will become wonderful people. But I've also interacted with enough of them over the years, on the university level, on the political level, to know that there are those, a minority, who want to have things improve. Between 1993 and 2000, while there was an effort made to implement Oslo, the hostility toward Israel, certainly on the West Bank, decreased as it looked more likely that the living conditions and the work conditions were going to improve. That's a kind of a reality. Now, Zionism. I was asked by one of my students to define Zionism. So I said, sure, happy to do it, but first, I want you to define for me what it means to be a Christian. Is the Christianity of Pope Francis the same as the Christianity of a Southern Baptist? Is that the same as the Christianity of a Russian Orthodox? And is that the same as the Christianity of a nun who is with the Sandinistas, or a televangelist who has one of the megachurches? Well, Zionism is exactly the same. Zionism starts with the premise of Jews having a right to a national entity, a national state, which is in Israel. But Martin Buber, the philosopher, and Judah Magnus, the first president of Hebrew University, were in something called Brit Shalom. Brit Shalom believed that the Zionist entity should be a binational entity with Jews and Arabs living along each other. They were Zionists. Menachem Begin had a different perspective. He's a Zionist. Ben-Gurion had a different perspective. He's a Zionist. The left-wing Meretz Party and the Labor Party, which have now merged and hopefully will come back into some kind of existence, they're Zionists. So when people talk about Zionists as a pejorative, that's anti-Semitic in the sense that not all Zionists are the same. Not all Zionists agree with one another. And surprise, there's a whole segment of the Israeli parliament, of the Knesset, that rejects this term Zionist for themselves. And I'm not talking about the Arab members of the Knesset, but about the ultra-Orthodox. They reject the idea that there should be a state that has been created by anything else other than the coming of the Messiah. I mean, they're taking full advantage of the state. That's not the issue. We need to get the term Zionist rebranded as a positive. Yes, Zionism as racism was a resolution. It was also rescinded. And you can get people to accept Zionism as a constructive national ideology. I mean, look, we are not necessarily going to convince people that we're right because we tell them that we're right. We may be able to get people to understand that we too have rights. For example, Israel should not exist because it took the land from the Palestinians. Okay, let's accept that for a moment. Last heard, Australia was populated by British felons whom they were shipped over there, and they all took over the land from the local indigenous population. No one is arguing that Australia should go out of existence and give back all the land. By the way, no one is suggesting that the United States or the state of New York give the local tribe that was here at the time of the Dutch the equivalent of $24 adjusted for inflation and some trinkets, give it back to them and say, okay, here's your land back. Yes.
When you're saying a two-state solution, or two states in an undefined form,
Yeah.
would you say that we were already at that before October 7th?
At the solution,
No, were we, when you're saying a two states in an undefined form, were we already at that?
we were and we weren't. When you have Hamas deciding that its goal is the destruction of Israel, that's not a workable solution. There are right now two figures among the Palestinians who might provide a solution. One of the men who has been sitting in an Israeli jail for about 25 years, a man named Barghouti, for being involved in the terrorist act. And the day he gets released from prison, I think will be the day that it will appear that it's likely that there's a negotiation pending. And by the way, he is not coming into this as a member of the Central Committee of Likud. He's coming into this as a strong Palestinian nationalist, but who over the years has expressed a willingness to work alongside Israel to create a state alongside Israel. The other is a man named Dahlan, who is a former Palestinian prime minister who had a falling out with Abbas, and I think is living in Kuwait in exile. But you need somebody of that nature who has a degree of confidence on the part of the Palestinians, who will view them as someone who has their interest at heart. And you need whether it's a Shimon Peres, whether it's an Ehud Olmert, whether it's hopefully a Benny Gantz, you need someone who is willing to sit down with them, which doesn't mean that they'll get what they want. The Israeli basis is it has to be a demilitarized state. Okay, fine. It's a topic for discussion. But somewhere the process has to start. That's basically where we are.
Thank you so much, Menachem.